Hello. The Daily Wire's Matt Walsh has exposed Vanderbilt's transgender clinic to the public. What all does this mean? Let's discuss. Welcome to the Forge and Anvil podcast, where we embrace uncomfortable conversations about culture and politics to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. And if you would like to support this podcast, be sure to go to forgeandanvil.locals.com. We appreciate your support. Joining us today to talk about this topic is our guest, Representative Ryan Williams. Ryan, feel free to introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me. First of all, I'm Ryan Williams. I am the state representative for the 42nd District, which is 80% of Putnam County here in Tennessee. Married for 25 years, have 2 adult children, which is weird to say because I'm an empty nester for about 6 weeks. And so they're both, one's signed a contract to dance, and the other one is a student at a local institution here in Tennessee.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you. And then, of course, joining us as always is our co-host, Zach Aval.
Well, great hunker doigle, folks. I don't know what that means. Zach Ball, my name, singer-songwriter, guitar player extraordinaire. Zach Ball Music is where you find me. I got a new album coming out the 14th of October, just a few weeks from now. It's called The Way We Were. I hope you dig it.
Awesome. And back from his week hiatus is our regular co-host, Michael Aper. Michael, say hi.
Hello, hello. My name is Michael Aper. I'm a God-fearing seminarian that works to change worldly culture with biblical truth.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, we will get right into our story for the day. So I'm actually going to read a tweet thread from Matt Walsh talking about his work on the Vanderbilt story. That way, those of you who do not have context can get a little context, and then we'll discuss. So this is the beginning of his tweet thread. So, breaking. My team and I have been investigating the transgender clinic at Vanderbilt here in Nashville. Vanderbilt drugs, chemically castrates, and performs double mastectomies on minors. But it gets worse. Here is what we found. Let's start at the beginning. Vanderbilt opened its trans clinic in 2018. During a lecture the same year, Dr. Shane Taylor explained how she convinced Nashville to get into the gender transition game. She emphasized that it is, quote, a big moneymaker, especially because of the surgeries require a lot of follow-ups. Vanderbilt was apparently concerned that not all of its staff would be on board. Dr. Ellen Clayton warned that conscious objections are problematic. Anyone who decides not to be involved in transition surgeries due to religious beliefs will face consequences. That was a quote. In case the objectors hadn't gotten the memo, Vanderbilt unveiled a program called Trans Buddies. The Buddies are trans activists from the community who attend appointments with trans patients, monitoring the doctors to guard against unsafe behavior such as misgendering. Vanderbilt makes their trans buddies available to children too. They make lots of services available to children, including chemical castration, though at some point in the last month, they removed explicit admission of this fact from their site. Here's the archive screenshot. And of course, he is providing videos and screenshots to go along with all these quotes. But they must have forgotten to delete a video from Vanderbilt's psychiatric YouTube channel back in 2020, which admits explicitly that they will give and have given irreversible hormone drugs to children as young as 13. After they drug and sterilized the kids, Vanderbilt, as explained in the video presentation by plastic surgeon Julian Winokur and physician's assistant Shaylin Vanderbloemen, will happily perform double mastectomies on adolescent girls. So let's review. Vanderbilt got into the transgender game, admittedly in large part because it is very financially profitable. They then threatened any staff members who objected and enlisted a gang of trans activists to act as surveillance in order to force compliance. They now castrate, sterilize, and mutilate minors as well as adults, while apparently taking steps to hide this activity from the public view. This is what healthcare has become in modern America. So I know that was a lot, but I wanted to make sure everyone had the full context. So before we kind of dive into how this story is developed, gentlemen, feel free to give your thoughts.
Well, I guess I'll go first. Obviously, as a legislator who helps write public policy for the state. To say that I was surprised by this, I think probably is an understatement. I think there was a lot of discussion in the Tennessee General Assembly about certain treatments that some individuals hope to get for their children or adults that were currently going on. But it was a huge surprise to us. I do think it doesn't go without saying that from my point of view, anytime you do these kinds of surgeries on children, it's barbaric. It should be outlawed. It is a permanent decision to a point of view that one might easily change. We've seen the opportunity for many folks, but gender identity is here to stay. We have lost for many decades just a clear understanding of who we are based upon our understanding of history, and gender ideology is just the latest form of gender dysphoria or binary decisions. So it's really disheartening. Obviously, as a parent who's raised kids in Tennessee, the idea that we would give a child a double mastectomy is barbaric and unconscionable to me. And so that's just my first thoughts on what I heard when I was able to read the Twitter feed of Matt Walsh. I guess it was a little over a week ago.
Yeah.
I think it's very disturbing. Part of what the investigation on the Vanderbilt clinic is showing is not just what they're willing to do, but the attitude with which they're doing it. And the Dr. Shane Taylor, her video even goes into greater detail than the excerpt that Connor read, where she very clearly says, if you're not comfortable doing this, then don't work here. And you're going to have problems if you have a conscientious objection to this for religious reasons or otherwise. What's concerning to me is, I guess I would like to understand from the medical perspective that would attempt to necessitate these procedures, by what standard do they measure these procedures as necessary medical treatment as opposed to elective surgeries? Because they borderline elective surgeries. You know, not all doctors are compelled to perform extra medical necessities and these responses to the gender confusion, or I guess that's not the best way to say it, but the dysphoria that's taking place seems like it would be an elective surgery or an elective procedure, whether it be chemical treatments, hormone therapies, or actual mastectomies or other physically invasive procedures.
Yeah, so to answer some of the medical stuff with that, because I had questions about that as well, and I did a lot of research this afternoon into that. So, because one of the concerns I have with that regarding kids is that there's seemingly no medical protections for them, which is bizarre because any other type of surgery there is. And I would stumble across in the Tennessean an article was a bit more impartial than Matt Walsh's take there, but he did, extensive research on that, so it can be understood his use of language there. But what was linked in there was the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, their standard of care procedures of what they recommend. So when it gets to that stage, so what it comes down to is that each patient is different. So they're arriving at these clinics and stuff like that at different stages. And so some of them end up just being, gender nonconformist, right? So that's more of a social decision there. They're not going to conform to whatever, social pressures are associated with being a man or a woman. And that's completely different than gender dysmorphia. So I think a lot of the times that gets lumped into that. And what I could find is that they did stress the importance of the psychological element So before you even get to have that surgery, there is either have to be a history, like a medical history of gender dysphoria. So presumably somebody who's showing up to a clinic like this has already talked extensively with a therapist and a psychologist and a psychiatrist and things like that before they, it's not like they're handing these things out, or at least that is my understanding of it. I know in certain cases that's not necessarily true. So what concerns me about this particular story is if these standards set forth by, and this is the document I had read was the seventh version of that document. So this has been edited several times since the late 70s. So which means there is, a practice built off this. So if they're not adhering to ethical standards outlined in these recommendations there, that is a huge problem. And one of them is it does deal fairly extensively with children. And it talks about how gender dysphoria for children doesn't really persist into adulthood, but for adolescents. So an adolescent, and just for reference, is somebody who's like 13 to 18, right? So that crucial stage in your physical and mental maturation there, there's no formal studies done on that continuing into adulthood, but that seems to be the pattern. So with the really little kids, I'm agreeing with you guys that we shouldn't be performing these types of surgeries on children. But the argument, is it medically necessary, seems to be, just on the research that I did for a few hours today, seems to be next to zero. So it's bizarre that they're even offering that.
Well, I think we're seeing a convergence between an understanding of what's medically necessary and what's mentally prescribed. There's been a big argument here recently. Mental health is health. And I think there's a big challenge there as we look at anytime this is making a health decision, a physical revision to a person because of their mental health, and the driver is their mental health. And so not any other place have we made decisions like this. And I think the biggest challenge though is in there, when there are no absolutes and there is no absolute truth, and the absence of absolute truth, it's all dysphoria. It's all up for grabs. It's all permissible. And so I think when you look at it through the scope of the absence of, it's the difference between non-binary and binary. I mean, the difference between absolute truth and no truth, or your own truth, or what you perceive your truth to be. And when I mean absolute truth, I mean an absolute truth based on a moral aptitude or a moral people, which is how we generated all the common and natural law that was the guide of how we make law for the last 200 years. It's just amazing, really, that we have gotten lost in our own pursuit of wisdom and just found folly at every turn.
Yeah, absolutely. When truth leaves the conversation, or at least the idea that there can be an agreed upon truth, that definitely makes things immediately be built on shaky ground. Now, I know the story has developed quite a bit in terms of what's happened since the story has broke. And I know that you, Representative Williams, you had been a part of a group of legislators that sent out a letter to Vanderbilt, as well as there's been talks of the governor potentially opening up an investigation. So maybe you could just expand upon that and kind of give our audience a little bit of an update on what that looks like.
Of course, first of all, in response to Governor Lee, I think the very next day, if not the evening of the release from Matt Walsh, called for an investigation. I think really depending upon your frustration or concern regarding that, there were some of my colleagues who said, what do you need to investigate? He's done all that for you. You know, it seems pretty cut and dry. I think what Mr. Walsh has not been able to do is provide a smoking gun. This person, HIPAA laws prevent that from doing that. There's a lot of anecdotal data or evidence, which I think is wise for the governor to call for an investigation. I fully support his desire to do so, with the understanding that he would share his investigation, his group's investigation. I know he's been reaching out to the speaker and lieutenant governor about their involvement. As you well know, the House did send out a letter, and on that letter, the speaker has signed on to it. I do think it's important for your listeners to know that the speaker, like I and most of my colleagues, we deem this to be barbaric for kids, and I think that that's kind of the stance that we've taken so far. You mentioned a letter. We did. Represented Zachary, good friend, in Tennessee or in Farragut or Knox County, and I communicated back and forth about the draft versions of the letter, and he was mostly his work. I encouraged him to really set deadlines. If you had an opportunity to receive the letter, I think, Connor, I gave you a copy of the letter, so you could post it or send a link on your website, you know, for people to see that if they want. But really just asking for Vanderbilt to really cease any and all of these activities that are currently going on in good faith, to allow the legislature to be able to act in January as it relates to that. Vanderbilt, whether it was unknown to all those groups or only known to a few, they have been very responsive so far, I think, to the legislature and what information they can share, they have. You know, if one child has had a top surgery there at the age of 15, that's one too many, in my opinion. And so, but they've been pretty good about communicating. They're a long-standing institution in our state, and they have a reputation and quite frankly, a heritage institution that has a reputation to uphold. And so I think they're really concerned about that. So we've given in that letter, we've given them an opportunity to respond within a certain period of time as an individual leadership and also as the board. I think they are in receipt of it. I would say that in my communication with Vanderbilt today, that you'll probably see a response from them before the week is out this week. And so it was good that they did that. I do think that one of the things that Matt really, the conscientious objector is a really, you know, important component, I think, of this process, that people should be able to say no without losing their jobs. And then I think the other thing that is really an important component of it is this idea of some kind of Gestapo group of people that are really an enforcement arm of this kind of ideology, which really is probably, for me, is probably the most disturbing component of
the trans buddies part. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's probably the most disturbing. It's very manipulative and concerning, really, because even if a child had concerns or questions, you know, who's to say this person doesn't say, well, you've already signed up, we've already got an appointment, you know, you really need to do this. And it really becomes some undue burden or an undue pressure on a child whose capacities by natural development wouldn't have a frontal lobe that's completely developed until they're in their 20s. And so it's a very challenging thing, but I think that's a long answer to kind of where we are as it relates to the governor and the legislature. But I think even being in this circumstance, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think for most of us, I think all but two of my colleagues in the House majority signed on to the letter, and so it's definitely something we want to see change pretty quick.
Yeah. So when it comes to, you mentioned earlier the smoking gun. So could you maybe elaborate more on what you think the smoking gun needs to be? Because I know that there's going to be listeners that are, watching this podcast, and they're going to, I think a lot of people are going to be inclined to say, well, the smoking gun is the fact that there was already a threat against religious objections, as well as, the fact that these surgeries are occurring in general. So maybe can you build that out a little bit for our audience to better understand?
Yeah, I think, of course, Mr. Walsh did a great job of organizing different components of the details. And although I believe it to be barbaric that someone would want to do this to a child, one of the things that is not yet clear is, were the discussions that they were talking about gender reassignment surgeries, either top or bottom surgeries, were those in discussion as it relates to adults or children, and adults and children. And so there's not really been a real clear bifurcation of that. So we don't know the populace. Is it hundreds of adults and 4 children, or 40 children and 5 adults? For me, a smoking gun would be some actual data that said, this is how many procedures we done, and here's them stratified in their age categories. I think that, for me, gives us a better clarity as to which, whether it's the buddy program or the conscientious objector, we don't know if that related to just kids or to gender reassignment surgeries altogether, because I would bear to say that there are some physicians that says, well, not only do I not agree with the kids doing it, I also don't agree that adults should be doing this. And so I do think, when I mean a smoking gun, I think we have a lot of proof that, there is a fire. We see smoke, we feel heat, but we haven't really necessarily seen the definitive flame of what it is has actually occurred and how many times it's occurred. For instance, we know that we're pretty certain that there was some top surgeries on minors, but we're pretty sure there's no bottom surgeries on any minors at all. But we still don't know that until we do an investigation to find out what those details are. But in the meantime, all those should cease until we're able to sort through it. Does that make more sense, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when it comes to these kind of procedures, obviously Tennessee is a very conservative state where the bulk of the population would not agree with these kind of procedures. But we do like to explore kind of the larger questions here on this podcast of, what should be our response to this as believers, as well as, just Americans in general. And I'm curious, and this question's for all of you guys, what you guys think the proper response in terms of both legislation and, of course, how we address these kind of issues from a social standpoint.
If I can speak kind of not so much to the legislation, which we've told on up until this point, an underlying fact that precedes these procedures and the elections for these procedures, particularly pertaining to minors, is that for them to be assigned their trans buddies, that whole system, and for them to elect to have this procedure done, they need to have the approval and advocation of their parents or a guardian. The guardian is not only saying, yeah, go ahead and do this, but they're also signing off on the HIPAA violations or HIPAA laws to say that this buddy can be involved in the medical proceedings and the conversations between the physician and the patient. So these buddies are being included, but they are being included by the election of the parents. So all of this, to me, it's enabled by the guardians for minors in particular, obviously, but that is something that it, aside from legislation, it points back to the home life, to the family unit, what is being promoted within the home, what is being promoted within families, how are children who experience this these gender issues of feeling that they are wrongly in one body as opposed to another, or feeling that they have been assigned a gender identity that's not of their own feelings of identity. A lot of this is being backed up in the home and through our culture and through the micro governance that takes place at home around the dinner table or around the television or whatever it is that these families are gathering in whatever structure of family that is present, if any. And my concern is, of course, the legislation, but legislation will always fall short of morality and ethical revisions that will take place in the home. So what Representative Williams has been talking about, of how his convictions are against these procedures, evidently there's many patients whose home life and their upbringing and their identities are being marred by the convictions or lack thereof of the people influencing them. And that's something that's highly concerning to me. And I would say it's just as important to understand and know how we can love the world in a Christ-like way, so that they can not feel this desperation to reassign their identity, to manipulate the identity that's been given to them. Ultimately, when I look at Scripture and I think of our salvation, I would hope and pray that our identity is validified through Christ alone and not through a gender identity anyway. And certainly there's room for conversation about that as it pertains to the home life and the family unit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Zach, you tend to be, much more libertarian. So, as someone who's a little bit more live and let live, how would you, what would you say would be a proper response? Do you think this is something that should be, made illegal in terms of, for minors, or is that something that you have a cutoff age after a certain point of development, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I mentioned, like, it's the standards and like the medical practices around this compared to other things is still so new. I mean, like I said, the first issue of that document, I think I traced it back to 1979. So that's, in the broad spectrum of human history and just even medical history is fairly recent. So to answer that question, no, yeah, so no, for children, is not something that should be allowed. The reason being is because even for adults, when they come to this decision, when they come to a clinic like this for gender reassignment surgery, and I think this is one of the things that when this issue is talked about, I think all sides kind of leave out, is that there's just a lot of education that goes into that, and that's by nature, because there are serious long-term consequences, let's say, to either decision, whether you decide to proceed with a surgery there or decide not to. There are going to be consequences for that, and a child's not going to understand that. They barely have some, even though kids are, I think, are smarter than we think they are, they still are trying to figure out the world, and that their actions have consequences. So something that can potentially affect, a long term, kids don't really think long term like adults do. So they're not going to understand the gravity of what they're trying to accomplish. So it shouldn't be, certainly it should be pushed upon them, and it shouldn't be something that is taken as gospel, let's say, when a kid comes forward and wants reassignment surgery. It just seems that either there's something I'm missing, as I've tried to research this, about the difference between when an adult goes into the surgery and from a kid, but it seems like it's being accepted far too loosely. Really, I mean, it starts with it's an educational thing to me. Like, if you have gone through it with your therapist and you've gone through it with a psychiatrist there, and you understand the consequences of what are your best. So even as an adult, I'd still think there should be, restrictions, at least in terms of like how it's provided there, to make sure that it's done ethically. and that is done safely as well, but it shouldn't be offered to children at all. Just there is no real clear data on how gender dysphoria persists in adolescents versus children and adults later on that I could find that would make me feel confident. And this is a document provided by experts in this field, right? So if this is what they're saying, I'm not comfortable at all opening that conversation up to children, both just, based off my religious convictions and my political convictions. I can't endorse it for children. But if you're an adult, that is a decision. As long as you've pursued, and educating yourself on the consequences medically and psychologically and everything like that, I think it's fine. But for kids, not at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot to respond there. So Representative Williams, if you want to respond to that, feel free. But I also ask you, with the time that we have left, just looking through some of the reporting by local outlets done on this story, a lot of the frustration that I have seen is that some outlets are bringing up the fact that I guess there was a couple of bills that were brought up as early as 2018, I believe, to address some of the issues going on at Vanderbilt. That was with Senator Janice Bowling and Representative John Reagan. So I think there is a lot of people on the ground here that are frustrated, feeling like they are kind of aware now because of Matt Walsh. But many Tennesseans didn't realize that there was actually some representatives that already knew about the going-ons at Vanderbilt and tried bringing some legislation early on. So I guess the sentiment seems to be that there's a lot of people that are frustrated that it's taken this long for action. So I was wondering if you maybe, had any insight on what the actual proceedings have been surrounding that, to maybe unpack that a bit for the audience, as well as, give some clarity. Because I think a lot of people are frustrated that they feel like actions only be taken because someone with as large of a platform as Matt Walsh has brought attention to it, that now actions being taken. So if you can maybe speak a little bit more to that for our listeners, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think to go back to really what was said before, I think if you do a lot of research regarding kids minors who had gender reassignment surgery and who want to and felt like it was a huge mistake, these people are probably some of the best resources to communicate with people about. But I do think it's really important to focus on the parents of those children. The interesting part about that is these children, parents, Connor, you've got an 11-month-old, I think now. There's nothing you wouldn't do for that 11-month-old. All you ever want her to do is be happy and to be successful and to prosper and things to go well. And I think sometimes a parent is in issues of mental health are all they really want to do is help their kids. And then after they go down this path and their kid wakes up from this slumber, for lack of better terms, the parents are always saying, I only wanted to do what my kid wanted me to do, And I think what happens is parents have to be parents. Parents have to lead, right? And likewise, the church has to actually give a better example and be more vocal, really, about what their beliefs are and stop. We are living in a post Roe Wade environment only because people were persistent for 4 decades, right? It's not because, and the Lord answered our prayers. The weird part about that is that we haven't really learned a lesson. The church and people of faith need to step out and be different and difference makers in their community and not just sit back on their heels. And so I just thought it was important to say that. Second, as it relates to John Reagan and Janice Bowling, I remember John Reagan and I came in together in the legislature. I remember one of his first bills because it singed my psyche. It changed my view on what it meant to be a lawmaker. And it had to do with laws prohibiting genital mutilation, which happens in some religious faiths around the world. And we had to have this discussion in Health Committee, of which I was the subcommittee chairman on. It was uncomfortable, right? But this discussion was being had because this was going on in certain religious communities in our state. We knew for a fact it was going on. I understand that there's been some angst about Senator Bowling and John Reagan's bill. I sat in the Health Committee meeting, we had many discussions about this. I think what the difference is here is that we didn't know, and some of the miscommunication, we didn't know any of this was going on in our state. We are a red state among red states. We never thought for a million years that this would be happening in our state. And so they were on two different paths. They weren't the same path. So we had another bill up in the committee at the same time that had to do with hormone blockers for kids, and we were having a big discussion about that. It was a heavy lift, but we were having those discussions about hormone blockers because we knew that was going on in the state of Tennessee, and we had to get control of it. I think what happened with this is it just came out of left field, and no one envisioned this was even in our future, in the near future, much less it was going on. And what we found out is it was going on. And so I recognize that there is some frustration, but to say that we knew it was going on at Vanderbilt and we didn't do anything is simply not true.
Yeah. And of course I'm playing devil's advocate here, and
right.
I'm sure that there's so many sides to this story. I don't know if those representatives would say differently, or what the case would be. It sounds maybe like they were addressing one problem, and it seemed like it wasn't much of an existing problem, so not much took off there. And now looking back, hindsight, their legislation maybe would have prevented some of this stuff. So that's maybe where some of the frustration's coming about, is what it sounds like to me.
Agreed. I think that's fair. I also think it's fair to say that, most elected officials will always tell you, "I told you so," even when they didn't know before.
Especially on election season. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's definitely understandable. Well, we are almost out of time here, but I want to kind of go around for a moment. I want to make sure that people can connect with you, Representative Williams. So go ahead and just let people know where they can follow you, keep up with what you're doing, and be a part of what you're doing over in Nashville.
Thanks. Of course, you can find all my contact information online. You can just search my name, Representative Ryan Williams. My email is rep.ryan.williams@capital.tn.gov. You can email me anytime. On social media, I'm on Instagram, which I hate, Twitter, which I hate, and Facebook, which I hate, but it's just the nature of doing it all. But you can find most of those are Ryan Williams TN. And so people can, I'm terrible at direct messages on there, so send me an email. I'm happy to do them. But one of the things I will say is please come to Nashville. It's the people's house. I've been given the great honor to sit in a chair for several years and represent the people of the 42nd District. It is my honor to do so. But you'd be shocked who people want to tell you what you need to fix, but come be a part of the fix. I think that's the biggest challenge, that we don't do a very good job as believers. It's a duty, really, for us. And I think everyone should do that. I don't have a lot of people come visit me, but I'll make my office your office for as long as you want. You can go to as many committees and hear as many bills as my guest. Love to have you. I think it's really important for people to get involved so that you're ahead of the game and not constantly reacting to the news of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, Zach, where can people find you?
They can find me, Zach of All Music, on the interhighways. Particularly active on Instagram. Facebook is no more. Just everything on the Zach of All Music Facebook page is recycled from Instagram. So save yourself some time and just head over to Instagram, give me a follow, get excited for that new album. Until then, I want to remind everybody that the lottery is just a tax on people who are bad at math.
Well, Michael, we got about 40 seconds left. Go ahead and let people know where they can follow you, if anywhere, and feel free to respond to Zach's little nugget of wisdom.
I agree that the lottery is a tax on the uneducated. You can follow me right here on this podcast. And if you search for me on social media, then I suppose there's pages there for me, but whether I'm there is debatable.
Excellent. He is off the grid. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, if you are wanting to support the show, go ahead and go to forgeandanvil.locals.com. We appreciate your supports. Until next time.